everybody. Here we are. It is July 8th. This is Locally Sourced. Carter Hammond, broadcasting out of Peterborough, New Hampshire, that is. And today on the show, I'm going to be joined by Paul Cuno-Booth from the Keene Sentinel, and we're going to be talking about the role of journalism in communities and some deeper perspective there. And I might also, we'll see, I might have to take a minute after the interview to just quickly go over what happened at the listening session in Peterborough last night, because I think, in my humble opinion, it was quite problematic. And I think many other members of the community, as evidenced by the video, felt that way as well. And I think it's probably worth unpacking exactly what, without any animosity towards anybody as much as possible, to unpack exactly what the problem with that is, or maybe explore some of the ideas there. But that's all going to be later. This is an interview that I've been wanting to do for a while in terms of helping to sort of clear the air and build trust with media in the community. And so I was lucky enough to meet Paul at the March for Justice in Peterborough, and we had spoken. I asked him if he could come on and we'd do this sort of broader objectivity conversation. And so with that, I'm going to bring on Paul Cuno-Booth right now. Paul, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I am good. I'm good. So, yeah, it's been a wild time for news lately.
Yeah. I mean, kind of any time is a wild time for news
right.
Over the past few years.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely, and I mean, and that's something that's not just a national thing. Like would you say that that's like also a very local thing too, that as we see things get heightened in the national context, we see it get heightened in the local context as well?
Yeah, and actually that is one way the past several months feel different, right? A lot of the major national stories of the past several years, they don't trickle down to like the local level as much, but coronavirus certainly has, and of course the protests after George Floyd have as well, and continue to. So it's definitely felt different just in terms of the intersection of national and local news.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it feels like a very alive time. So I guess that gets into sort of like the first question that I wanted to ask you, which is, so how do you personally view the role of journalism like here in communities in New Hampshire, and how does that compare to other places that you've lived or worked? What's that interaction like?
Yeah, so I have not actually worked at a local paper anywhere else. I have lived in a few other places, but the last place I lived in Colorado, I was working at a running magazine, so it was a little bit different.
Sure.
But to answer the other part of your question, here I definitely see it as a couple different roles. There's obviously the just kind of disseminating information that's important, but we also have the internet to do all that. So I think there's a lot of other stuff that we add value to. Some of that is just verifying information. So there's a lot of times you'll hear a report come over the scanner that seems super dramatic, or someone's posting something on Facebook about an incident, and then you call the fire department or police department, and it's actually a much less dramatic version of that. So that's part of it, is being able to get the actual verified story out there. I think some other important roles are just helping the community keep track of what are the major issues that people are dealing with locally, what are the things their elected representatives, town and state on up are thinking about and doing. I actually reviewed our mission statement before coming on, and it talks about empowering people to engage in the community. Mm-hmm. So if we can give someone, not just here's what's going on at city council this this evening, but here's the context, here's the whole
Mm-hmm.
backstory of this, and here's how it ties into other issues and all. So it's highlighting those things, it's contextualizing these things, it's giving people the information they need to go out and do whatever they want with it, really. I mean, if they want to sit at home and do nothing else, that's fine. If they want to go petition their government, that's great. Like, it's kind of up to them.
But it's like, it's the role of a free press to be doing this kind of thing. And I think like,
Yeah.
I think also it reminds me of that old saying, like the news is the first draft of history, and I think that when I hear this, it sounds like within the mission statement is built in the concept of that I've been exposed to, that people call like solutions journalism, that your
Mm-hmm.
idea is to create avenues by which people can solve whatever, issues, or interact with, or handle, or change whatever issues are coming up that they might have a strong feeling about when they read it in the paper. That there's a key role served by this type of local journalism that has a mission statement like that it views it as a service to the community in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important piece to highlight is, obviously a big part of our role is pointing out problems where they exist.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think complementing that is also saying, okay, how are communities addressing this? And,
Right.
we cover something like 30 towns in the Monadnock region. So that's really an opportunity to say, what is Brattleboro doing, or what is Peterborough doing about housing or policing? That's maybe a
Right.
model for what Keene could do. Or you know this small town in the south of the county is experimenting with this way of retaining more police officers, because hiring is so difficult. Is That's a lesson that could apply more
Sure.
broadly. So yeah, we definitely try and think about that, not just doom and gloom, things
Right.
are hard, but also here's people trying to change that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that actually kind of touches on the like. I think the covering multiple towns, I think, is an interesting sort of jumping off point for this idea of collaboration between like the both the collaborative nature of journalists having to work with people who might have more expertise in certain areas rather than wherever you're stationed at. Like if you live in Keene, you might need to know people in Peterborough, or you have to have familiarity with like other papers or other folks.
Mhm.
But also the idea that communities are interacting with each other to try and solve problems and learn from each other. I think that's always something that you can feel like you can feel kind of isolated in your community, or like, I'm dealing with these problems in my town, and
Mhm.
the idea that, well, you really can learn a lot from looking at what the other communities next to you are doing. That there's the idea of a more expanded community that is regional. You know what I mean? Like a community of
Mhm.
communities. And I guess I'm just, how do you look at that kind of a perception of collaboration? Do you find that
Mhm.
there's a sense of camaraderie between journalists in this state? Do you find that, like, with papers on a maybe on a more state level, to sort of expand on
Mhm.
the metaphor, like, do you see collaboration occurring within those spaces? Do you see there being profit motives or political leanings that have maybe like made some of those relationships more difficult? Without taking a stance on it, I mean, I
Sure,
just,
sure.
I obviously understand that you need to sort of remain objective as a
Mhm.
reporter, but it's more of a question of like, how well is this collaborative functioning,
Yeah, that's there's a lot there. So
Yeah.
let me start with just more the kind of regional town piece,
Hmm.
and then talk about journalistic organizations.
Cool. Yeah, please.
When it comes to covering the towns, unfortunately, we can't be at every select board meeting everywhere all the time. I wish we had 30 journalists to do that, but we don't. But so
Yeah.
we really are trying to think about what's the if we're covering something in Nelson, what's the big thing, right? If Nelson is dealing with some multi-million-dollar bond issue, that matters a great deal. We'll probably cover it. Um, but routine town business, it's more, okay, well, is there something going on in Nelson that maybe is a version of it is happening in Surrey and Roxbury and Richmond? And so by covering it in one place, we can kind of, enlighten more of our readers, right? And I think that gets to, um, gets to part of that question, right? I was thinking about a year ago. Richmond was debating technically abolishing their police department, but not in the way we think of right now. Basically, it's a small town, and they were having this discussion of, do we have the financial resources to maintain our own police department, or can we have, pay the sheriff's office less money, but to provide the same services, and they ultimately went with that. And that was a story. It's about Richmond specifically, but several other towns had taken that step, and it sort of got at some of these bigger issues of, how do you maintain essential services when you're a very small town? How do you hire good people, right? If you are, one of the things Richmond was struggling with was, I think it was like a 3-person department or something like that, but one of the positions was consistently vacant, and all that. So in our coverage, I think that's one thing we can really do is, okay, you're living in one part of the county, you might not be up on what's going on everywhere else, but a lot of these towns are dealing with the same issues. And the same goes for solutions. If there's a group in Peterborough doing interesting things with economic development, maybe that's something that people in Dublin want to sort of do a version of or link up with. Maybe there's a version of that happened in Keene. I kind of think of it as, these 3 hubs, right? We do cover Brattleboro, even though it's in Vermont. You have Brattleboro, Keene, and Peterborough, and then some, varying degrees of smaller towns sort of in between. But so that's sort of the region we cover. The bigger question about news organizations, that's a really good one. I think the traditional view is, we're competitors, and we're all kind of chasing our own thing. And there's definitely some of that. I'm not going to just hand over a good story tip I have, but we're definitely increasing collaboration. I think formally and informally. So there's a organization called the Granite State News Collaborative that's doing a lot of both producing their own stories that any member outlet in the state can run, but then also kind of fostering links between different outlets. And one thing that's been really great in the past few months is the collaborative has basically made it possible for any of us to share coronavirus coverage from other outlets, right? So if the Ledger Transcript or the Concord Monitor has a really good piece on restaurants or PPE shortages or whatever, rather than us having to like run out and re-report the same story, we can publish their story, obviously with credit, in our paper and online, and vice versa. They can run stuff from us. So that's been a big help in that. I think it kind of amplifies the force of any one paper. You get to kind of bolster it with what other journalists are doing around the state. There's also just a lot of it's a small community of journalists in New Hampshire. A lot of us have met at whether it's like the scene of a major news event or at like conferences and through other ways. So there's a lot of just informal collaboration that I've found where, someone will reach out to me and say, hey, I saw you did that story, and I'm interested in doing a version of it. Do you have any advice? That actually happened with some of the recent reporting on use of force reports. I was actually, before that story came out, I was tweeting about how I was filing records requests for all these police departments in our area, and got a message from a Seacoast area journalist saying, hey, I want to do the same thing in my area. How did you go about that? And that, like, I think it's great that like that doesn't directly compete with me because we don't cover any of the same towns, and I'm always happy when we can kind of amplify each other's work. So I could definitely see more collaborations going forward in the coming years, on various levels in the state. The other part of it, you mentioned sort of financial and political uh, motives or forces, and I think for the most part, our news organizations in New Hampshire are fairly nonpartisan. That's not to say we don't have various subjective positions we're coming from, and we can talk more about that, how
Yeah, I mean,
personal bias factors in. But
yeah,
just on the financial aspect, I will kind of mention that there's just a sort of ongoing challenge that a lot of newspapers have, which is declining ad sales, people getting a lot of content for free online. So
right.
trying to make sure we have enough subscribers. And so how do we support good journalism? And again, I think one way to do that is collaborating across outlets rather than every outlet having to sort of have its own team to do the same work.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good point. And I mean, like, what I, like, one thing I think is, I to me this gets into, like, we're talking about a profession that it serves a very important purpose for the public. Like, it is baked into the Constitution, inherently, to say that, like, the importance of a free press is in large part to hold accountability for what we do. And so there's a dimension of it where it's like it is a public service, but the way you guys have to keep doing your work, and I mean, it's the same thing with what I do here, it's you need money to do it. And I don't, the one, I'm glad that you're bringing this up, because something that I'm always trying to explain to people is that you're oftentimes folks misunderstand, like, what journalists do, how much work goes into it, how much they're actually getting paid to do what they're doing. You know what I mean? Like, there's such an incredibly high level of expectation from the media. And in my own experience, it's one thing to say the media, but if you want to characterize it as such, okay. But when it gets down to it, oftentimes what you're really talking about is, like, all right, well, is what I'm looking at just straight news, or is it as like an editorial? Am I looking at opinion stuff like that? Because I know that that's a huge dimension of things as well. And I think people don't necessarily like those two can get conflated in the minds of just regular citizens, because if you're not constantly consuming the news and that's not your whole thing, then why would you care? You know what I mean? Like, why would you, without if we didn't have a good civics base and education, then why would you even know to look for that, right? But I think it's important to draw a distinction that we ask a lot of the media, which shoulders the weight of responsibility on journalists to really sort of carry that truth through scrutiny, very much so like a regular public official does, except there's no, like, government guarantee that you guys get to keep going. So when the money dries up from advertising, and print starts to go down because the internet makes things widely available, what do you do, and how do you recoup that money, and how do you stay afloat while simultaneously facing intense scrutiny for, what could have been, mishandled editorials or even news stories in the past, during a time where news was quite lucrative and the notion was to just sort of, like, how do you make the dollars? And so the collaborative aspect is really important to me, because when you tell me this story of you getting in touch with this journalist from the Seacoast and the way that you guys work together, I think it's important to indicate that journalists themselves are indeed members of the community. Like, you guys have to, like, you live in homes in these areas. You have to know, like, in order to do your job well, you have to be able to talk to people. You have to be able to stay open to folks all the time. And I think, that's an important aspect of things. And I guess what that really gets into is, it's in a lot of ways, our reporting is so much relying on the basis of these individuals who do this hard work of going out and collecting this information, right? But sort of the follow-up to that is the concept of inherent bias, right? So yes, there's like maybe bias perpetuated by profit motive in a more institutional sense, right? And maybe that's not as much of a problem now because things are changing, or that's something that we could at least sort of like look at in the past. But what I'm curious about is your take on the concept of bias in journalism as experienced by the journalists themselves, and how do you view the concept of objectivity or objective journalism? So yes.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is something that's being discussed like nationally among journalists. It's a really interesting conversation, and my thinking on it is very much a work in progress. So, but I'll give you kind of my working answer. Just to mention something you said a second ago about us being under scrutiny and held accountable. Like, we should be under a lot of scrutiny. We have a very important job, and what we write can affect people's lives, and so we definitely do want to be held accountable. And when we get things wrong, it's probably not out of malice, but just let us know. We want to hear that. And working at a community paper, I've seen the city manager in the grocery store. I've seen prosecutors in the grocery store. I've run into defense attorneys, at social gatherings and things. So it's a small community, and you kind of know if you mess something up, you're going to maybe see that person the next day, which does not mean you don't do hard hitting journalism, but it does mean it has to be fair and accurate, right? So if the prosecutor or city manager doesn't like something I wrote yesterday, I'm okay with that, but I want them to read it and feel like, okay, well, his facts were right. He gave me an opportunity to speak. He fairly represented my position and all that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so definitely, hold us accountable for what we write, what we don't write, if there's stuff we're missing. Objectivity. The first thing I'll just kind of mention is the distinction you brought up between editorial and news, and I think that's really important. It's just they have different functions, right? And they're different people doing that. Our editorials are a group of editors at the paper, basically working together to kind of say this is the editorial board's thought, opinion or perspective on a certain issue. They research it. It is fact-based, but it is taking a particular stance on an issue, local, state, national. News stories, that's just not the purpose. So I'm not involved in the editorial writing process at all. I'm totally on the news side. And with news, we might cover the same thing an editorial does, but it's about gathering what facts we can and putting different perspectives in there with nuance and fairness and accuracy, right? So, my news story on the subject that someone else might write an editorial about would say, hey, here are some different perspectives on this issue. Here are the basic facts you need to know. And, maybe you think this guy's perspective is right. Maybe you think this other one is right. That's not, for me to say. When it comes to objectivity more broadly, I think it's helpful to think of it as a process more than like a fixed position, right? So it's not like somewhere in the middle of a spectrum between liberal and conservative or whatever. It's really about having this process of gathering facts, verifying facts, understanding issues with nuance, and then figuring out a way to convey that. A big part of that for me, at least, and this is just like how I think of it. I'm not speaking for anyone else right now, but I really think about separating questions into, okay, what is a factual question? And that's something where I should be able to figure out the answer or at least try. And then there are questions that are more value judgments or moral or ethical questions where there is not necessarily one right answer, right? And it's not my place to say, this is what you should think about this. So just to an example, might be if there's a city council hearing about property taxes, right? And someone gets up and says, property taxes have been going up like crazy for 5 years and I'm sick of it. And this is, making it hard for me to live here and so forth. So if I have that quote, right, property taxes are going up like crazy is a factual statement that I can, and I would go and verify. I can look up city financial documents and see, oh, is this true? Is it partly true? Is it not true, right? And if I'm writing the story, I have a duty to kind of say, here's the actual facts that, the city tax burden is maybe going up, but it's, within inflation for each year, so, or whatever. But there's another part of what that person says, which is the sort of, emotional place they're coming from, or the way they're experiencing something. And I have to represent that as well. So objectivity to me in that sense is like, all right, I'm going to check out their factual claims, but I'm also going to make sure that I'm fairly representing their perspective or sort of emotional place they're coming from, that is not something you can fact check or verify or invalidate, right? So, and if there are people on the other side of it saying, actually, we support paying this amount of property tax because it gives us good services and whatever, I represent that position as well. And it's really about, conveying the scope of the debate in that hearing or whatever. Obviously, you get into much more fraught places when it's sort of some of these more politicized national issues. But I think of it with the same process. It's trying to think, what's a factual question and how can I best, approach that and actually gather facts and verify facts. And then what is the kind of more emotional or opinion-driven place where it's more about representing the debate and the diversity of views and putting that out there.
Sure. How much would you say how much time would you say you spend thinking about what voice or what perspective you didn't hear? Like if you're writing a factual story, right? I think about this in terms of like, okay, well, if I've read, if I'm hearing one side of the argument and I'm hearing another side, I always think like, okay, well, what's the third argument? What's like, if we're at a town meeting and 50 people are there, but you live in a community of 6,000, like there's that you don't necessarily know that like the broad spectrum of things is being represented. So and oftentimes, like I have heard people in the town, like from town government, say, well, if you want to ask the question or you want to make the statement, come to the meeting. And my reaction personally to that is like, well, that's not necessarily sensitive to the time of, say, busy parents who are working 2 jobs and trying to take care of their kids and feed them at night when you're having a meeting on a Thursday at 7, right? Like that's just like there might be somebody that wants to come and engage in that conversation that has a completely alternate take, but they can't make it. So what I'm wondering is, how much would you say you spend time thinking about that other perspective when going to write a story about like a town meeting like that?
That's a really good question. And what I would say is it sort of, it definitely depends on the situation, right? But I think you're getting at something that I do think about, which is that when you have a zoning meeting or a potentially controversial thing coming up on a town warrant, a lot of times, it's a little bit like Yelp reviews, right? Where if you're opposed to something, you have you're really motivated to go and speak up and say your piece. And if you're kind of fine with it, you just might not show up, right? And so that's something I do think about. I'm not sure that there's a way to address it in the context of just a you know one day meeting story, right? So if there's a zoning board or planning board meeting where they're talking about a proposed zoning change that maybe allows for more density, or maybe they're thinking about a potential housing development. This was a story I covered recently in Swansea. There was a proposed apartment block that would have been affordable housing for seniors, and a lot of people in the neighborhood said, this is out of character with how we think of the neighborhood. It's a lot of single family homes, and it's rural and has these beautiful views, and we don't want this like big apartment block there, right? And in that case, the point the developer was trying to make is, well, we're hearing from all the people in the neighborhood. We're not hearing from the seniors who may or may not live around here right now, but who are trying to find affordable housing. And part of that is just when you have something that has a very concentrated drawback, but kind of a diffuse benefit, right? If it makes things potentially, has a negative impact on a small group, but very concentrated group versus would sort of help a large group of people, you're probably going to hear from the voices who are opposing. And that's not, a critique of them. Obviously, like, people care about what happens in their neighborhoods. But that is something where I think about it. I don't know that there's a way, if I'm just covering the story of there was a meeting and 50 people showed up to oppose this thing and no one spoke in support except maybe the developer or the person who proposed whatever measure it is. That's going to be the story I write, right? I'm not going to kind of inject my own unsupported musings in there where I'm like, but also
Right.
I wonder what seniors are thinking. What I will say is, and maybe this is something I could do a better job of personally. I would like to is, all right, so we cover that, and it's the meeting, and these issues are raised, but then maybe the next day or the next week, you do, all right, let's do a story where we actually examine the state of affordable housing for seniors in the region, and the claims the developer is making about how difficult it is. Does that check out? And what is the experience of seniors who are trying to find housing, trying to maybe downsize from a full house to like an apartment? And that's something where it basically takes more legwork, right? People who are, if you're just trying to find seniors who need a housing option, right? That's much harder to actually find those people than just like who showed up to a meeting on a given day.
Right.
So I think part of it is just having that that notion of the reporting. It's sort of an ongoing iterative process in a newspaper, right? You're doing a lot of one-day stories, but then hopefully the body of work over time is sort of exploring different aspects. Okay, it's covering the meeting, but then it's also taking time to go talk to the people who weren't at the meeting, hopefully, or looking into the underlying issue of not just this housing complex, but maybe broader issues about housing in the region. I think it's definitely important to think about what perspective is not represented, and maybe even if it doesn't make it into this story, is there another story we can do that looks at that?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess like maybe to kind of like draw a parallel. Like I wonder, and I mean, feel free to like you can speak on this absolutely, but like the idea that, okay, well, I didn't get to it in this story, so rather than providing, say, okay, this developer invoked, well, you're not thinking of elderly like low-income elderly people who need to move here, right? So rather than saying at that time when you're writing that story, well, I can, like press on some contacts to see if anybody that like I can get put in touch with somebody so I can get a quote or an anecdotal like weigh in from this individual, as opposed to saying, let's just keep it out of this story and keep it contained to just the meeting itself, and then let's do another story here. So, and I'm not saying that one is better than another necessarily, but my question is to go back to this idea of objectivity and bias, right? Is that not in a sense a choice that the factual news staff is making about like the way the news itself is compartmentalized or sectioned out that could potentially affect the way people receive the news itself? Do you see what I'm trying to like?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a great point. And this is kind of one of the reasons that objectivity is a complicated notion, is that even if, everything in your story is factual and accurate, you are, as reporters and editors, making choices about what to include and what not to include. And so that's definitely a way that I think more than, people may think we're, reporters are slanted one way or another politically, and they can think that, and that's fine. But I do think, working in this, that the more relevant, I don't know if you'd call it bias, but constraint is just what you raised earlier, where you're doing a lot of work on a short time frame, and sometimes that kind of governs what you're able to include or not, right? So if there's a zoning board meeting Monday evening that goes from 7 to 9, I'm writing the story from 9 to 11 probably, and maybe that day before the meeting there was some reporting I was able to do. Maybe if I know that a certain person is really opposed or supportive, or maybe if I know I want to include some context generally about affordable housing, I can do that kind of legwork ahead of time and incorporate it. But yeah, part of the constraint there is just, we want to have Tuesday's paper needs to have something on Monday's zoning board meeting, because we want to make sure people get that news out, and that doesn't leave a ton of room for the sort of follow-up reporting, I guess, where you could say, oh, hey, like this group didn't actually speak at that meeting. Can I go reach them? I'm not going to, call seniors at 9 p.m. But that's where I think, again, it's trying to say, okay, like what did this story include and not include? And is there something, a voice we want to make sure to get in the next story, or an angle we want to explore with the next one? So that's sort of, I think, the way you have to remedy that.
Sure. Yeah. So, and I think, and this is like, I guess I'm trying to introduce this idea as a way to educate people who consume news, that like to understand the measure by which you can assess the news that you're getting, in a sense, or assess the quality of it, where you can say, okay, I'm going to look at the broad spectrum, like here's reports over the past month and what did they cover, and if they didn't get to something in this story, how deep did they go on it later? Like how much did they explore this out, to your point of like, well, let's do something more in depth about the need for more affordable housing for elderly folks, right? Like as you say, the body of work sort of has to speak for itself, and like you can only be what you had done, and that is a measure by which to understand the scope of something, and then also to see where those lines were drawn can also give the reader or the consumer insight into the way that these individual journalists are actually choosing to process what they're doing. So it's like I always encourage people, like, find journalists that you trust that are doing stories that you rely on. See what other journalists they trust and follow those people and follow the coverage they do. Don't necessarily, and I'm not saying anything like you should obviously support news institutions, but individuals may find that they get much more out of their news when they find a trusting relationship in a specific journalist. They know, okay, I can rely on this person to give me what I need, because the way they choose to break up information or parse it out helps to promote logical dissemination sans editorializing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's really important to try and foster both on the institutional level and the individual reporter level. I mean, I think we try to do that on the level of the Sentinel and making sure we're, a trusted source in general. But also, yeah, I mean, when I started working here, for example, you talk to someone, and I remember one of my first days, the Chamber of Commerce director in Keene kind of said, there's a lot of young reporters who kind of rotate in and out of here, and one thing they often lack is sort of the deeper context. So they'll, again, getting back to this sort of one day story, it's like they're writing about an event, and it's not necessarily that they get anything wrong, but they don't have that sort of built up institutional knowledge of this same issue came up 10 years ago. I think that is one way to balance that is sort of, we have a staff of editors who have been here for longer and do have some of that context. But yeah, I've also, frankly, I've talked to people who they'll have one experience where a Sentinel reporter got something wrong, where they felt they were misquoted, and then that colors their relationship to the next, however many reporters come after. And so it's about the institution, but absolutely as a reporter, I think about, every time I'm out there writing something, my credibility is on the line. Again, it's a small community, so people have different roles, and you never know when, like, the business owner you interview one day is also on the school board,
Right. Yeah.
is also active in this other group. And so if you get the story about the school board wrong, and then you try and call them about this other thing, that's a problem. So again, it's that,
Yeah.
it goes back to that, seeing people in the grocery store, like they're going to hold you accountable, and that helps me internally kind of hold myself accountable.
Right. And I think, and that's like, in many ways, like, I've heard sort of the anecdote that, like, well, it's actually much easier to have a corrupt local government than it is to have like a corrupt federal government, because of the same type of relationships that you're having. But what I find is, like, in contrast to that, it's actually much easier to hold accountability to, and is sort of more baked in to hold accountability to local journalists, because you guys are so much more directly connected with your community, because you have to see people in the grocery store. Like, you have to, like, we all have to deal with the repercussions of whatever we say or do as individuals, and that matters. And it's entirely different when you're, like, just writing stuff for national papers, and that there's the whole audience that you're hitting of angry people, for the most part, are on the internet only, and you're likely inside of a bubble in your own personal life that is less challenging. But that's a uniquely, like, the experience of a very, like, cosmopolitan major paper reporter might be very, very different from the experience of a local reporter. It's like, yes, when they make a mistake, it's on a national stage, but in a way it's almost easier to escape the come down of like the whole apparatus on you, that whole cancel culture thing, to have it slap you. It's almost easier to overcome that than it is to be like, yeah, I really hurt the feelings of, like, the local prosecutor who's gotten a whole bunch of people off because he did or said this one thing, and now I, and I didn't handle that well, and now I have to do, like, if you're going through this, like, whatever example you want to bring up, it's like, that's a much more personal, interactive thing, and in a smaller community, it deeply affects you. So I wonder if that makes it, like, if that, and I'm sure it's hard for you to say beyond, your own experiences, but yeah, it's something to sort of point out that there's an accountability measure for local journalists here that maybe, local public officials or national journalists don't experience that same
Yeah.
exact kind of scrutiny. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I'm also, I want to be accurate and fair to everyone, but
Mhm.
always, I always feel even worse when a private citizen who, speaks somewhere or whatever, if I get something wrong about them compared to a, local official who
Right.
chooses to put themselves in the public eye and under public scrutiny. Obviously, I strive to get,
Do
get
it
things
good
right
no
about
matter
them
what.
too,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it is that they also have more means of responding, right, and of
Yeah.
if a city council member feels he's been maligned in my story, he can get up at the next meeting and say something.
Right. This
Whereas
person has a platform,
yeah,
essentially. Yeah.
exactly. But yeah, no, I just getting back to the point about not having the ability to be in all towns at all times too. If you think we're missing something in your town that needs to be reported, tell us, right? A lot of times, the way we learn about this stuff is um, someone calls us and says, hey, the select board in X town is doing this, or hey, there's this dispute over this thing.
Hmm.
And I haven't seen anything about it in the paper. And that really helps us and also kind of lets us know what the community thinks we're not doing and should be
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that they, like, the community can totally reach out to you guys and engage with it more. um so I guess to sort of change gears a little bit here, but I mean, we can sort of keep it in line with
Sure.
community. Through this whole period of COVID-19, um in from your observations, having reported on it, what do you see have been sort of like the successes and deficiencies as communities describe them? Uh, do individual towns or individual communities find that they have like radically different goals than each other? I mean, I know that New Hampshire is the only state in the nation right now, I believe, where the COVID numbers are going down. However long that holds, we'll see. But I'm just sort of curious,
Yeah.
as like bird's eye view on the reporting that you've done. What are some of your takeaways?
So we started out by talking about how this is a national story that kind of comes down to the state and local levels, and I think that's been one of the challenges for me to report on it as a local journalist,
Mm-hmm.
and also for presumably for local officials. Just the forces here are so big, right? The virus itself, and then also the economic forces that I personally, I've been struggling sometimes to think about, like, what can I possibly write about on the local level that's like going to matter at all in the scope of all this. Uh, but I do think that, so a lot of the response obviously has been state led, at least the public health response, so especially some of the smaller towns where you just don't have a big staff. I don't know how much they've been able to do, for example, on the public health side. Early on, like back in kind of, I guess, late March, early April, I know there was initially some frustration from a couple officials, local officials I talked to, that at that time the state was only reporting sort of county level numbers. And
Right.
so some select board members in towns would be like, oh yeah, like I heard about our first resident getting COVID because the person who drove her to the hospital gave me a call.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of one of these things where local officials felt like, not all, I haven't talked to all of them, right, but a couple
Right.
that I spoke to felt like, hey, it would be kind of useful for us to hear this from the state in case there's anything we need to do. That obviously did change because a couple months ago where, if you remember, there were times where it was initially really restricted to certain groups like healthcare workers, first responders, and people who were seriously ill. And then there was sort of gradual expansions of, as the state had the capacity to do more testing, what people qualified, until now, I think, anyone who wants a test, even if you have no symptoms, can go get one. But so there was a period back then where you know, we were hearing from some people in Keene who were saying, like, I'm having trouble, I think I'm sick enough and I want to get tested, but I wasn't able to, or whatever.
Mhm.
I think those issues have sort of lessened somewhat in New Hampshire, at least, although we're hearing now about those things going on elsewhere in the country. In terms of the economic side, I can't say I've really been doing detailed reporting on what all the different towns in our area have been doing. There have been some, initiatives in Keene, at least, where downtown merchants have gotten together to sort of help one another. Making masks with logos of different businesses to sell and give those businesses some of the proceeds.
Mhm.
The mayor and chamber have been. I don't know if they're still doing them, but for a while at least, there were these kind of weekly roundtable conferences with businesses, and I think a lot of that was sort of making sure businesses were aware of some of the state and federal level opportunities for help, sort of facilitating some of that. But yeah, I mean, like I was saying, I think one of the struggles is just it's such a big story, and I think there's definitely things you can do on the local level, and I'm sure those will continue. But there's also these bigger forces that are somewhat uh, above my pay grade, I guess.
Yeah, no, totally. I understand. I mean, and maybe I guess I mean, for whatever it's worth, I mean, maybe the question kind of comes up like how how much can towns actually do?
Hmm.
Like maybe it's like I'm wondering if maybe that's and I'm certainly not trying to suggest that you write a story about this, but the idea of like, well, from the perspective of the people and the officials that they've elected. I know that this is something that's come up in Peterborough select board
Hmm.
meetings lately. Is this idea of like, well, our hands are pretty tied all the time in terms of what we can do that the state allows us to do, because
Yeah.
you can't, as the like New Hampshire itself is the type of state where if there's not a law saying you can do it, then you can't do it. So it's like if you go and you're like, hey, I want to do something, but it doesn't look like there's any provision in our current books, or there's no RSA that you can point to that says this is okay, then the answer is no, you can't do that. And so it that can tie the hands of mayors or selectmen when it comes to like being able to free up funds, or things are locked into annual budgets that can't be amended after a certain point in time, once they've had town meeting or whatever the case may be. And I'm wondering how much have we talked. I say we. I mean, how much has the conversation been present of the deficit between in control of local municipal governments to state level governments? Like how much can one get from the other?
Yeah. So this is, I think that's a really important point that is something I was thinking a lot about pre-COVID too, is just that we like to think of New Hampshire as having a lot of local control, and we do to some extent, but it's like whatever local control the state allows towns to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
I One thing I'm going to be really interested to watch, and I'm already hearing some concerns about this
Mm-hmm.
from local and county officials, is there are all these different ways that the state shares or is supposed to share revenue with county governments, local governments,
Mm-hmm.
school districts, and a kind of constant gripe of a lot of local officials is the state isn't paying its fair share, and that
Right.
just leaves us to either um, you know overtax local property owners or cut back on things. The meals and rooms tax is a great example of this. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of local officials have been saying for a long time, like the state promised us X amount of that revenue, and we're getting less than that, and we want more of it.
Right.
So one thing I'm really going to be watching as this goes forward is what do state lawmakers do with the potential for reduced revenue in general, right? Are they
Yeah.
going to start cutting back on some of the support they provide to different local governments, and then how do local governments handle that?
Cutting back
again,
on the support they're already not
right.
providing, right? Like,
Yeah, and this again, even pre-COVID, right? There have been a lot of local officials. For example, the county government has been, the Cheshire County has been trying to raise awareness for what they say is downshifting of costs from the state to the local level, and trying to get
right.
more, kind of a more concerted effort to get state lawmakers to address that. The school funding lawsuit that originated with Conval is kind of another version of this, right? Where the school districts say, you have to fund education under our constitution, but we don't think you're doing enough. And that's still kind of pending at the Supreme Court.
Which in many ways is a replay of the whole Claremont decision.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to watch going forward. First of all, separate of COVID, what do lawmakers come up with? What does the Supreme Court say? But also, what do lawmakers do in terms of the education funding? Are there any changes there? But then also, are there funds in place now that are kind of scaled back, or ideas that maybe would have gone forward to revise some of this that now stall? And then, what is the effect on local governments? Do taxes go up? Do they make cutbacks? Getting back to this sort of idea of limited local control. One thing I'm always struck by going to town meetings is there's sort of the debate of, well, we want to do this thing and we think it's important, but that's directly tied to our local taxes going up, and that's going to hit low-income seniors who have a fixed income, and these other vulnerable groups. And one thing towns in New Hampshire don't have really is the ability to say, what if we want our own kind of different tax structure, right? It's governed by the state. And so there is sort of this like very linear relationship in a lot of cases, right? Where it's like, all right, if they have, less revenue coming in, then they're going to need to cut stuff or raise taxes. And
sure,
I'm sure that'll be a discussion going forward.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think the thing for, and again, this starts to get a little like into the political question, I guess. And you don't have to weigh in on it here. It's just sort of like the one sort of thing I want to put on this is the question of like, are we just taxing inappropriately in the first place? Like, is the way that we're going about this not helping? That's a rhetorical question. Like I said, you don't have to answer that, but it's the idea of how can individual towns figure out a different way to tax is still sort of like, in a lot of ways, like we're trying to work within the confines of what we're given, as opposed to saying like, well, what if the whole thing is kind of broken in the first place? But I think that's at the very least what that would do is that to even start in on that kind of reporting or to discuss that at all prompts the question of how do we have more equitable ways to fund things, and how do we make sure that we're not, that we don't necessarily perceive every way to save money as cutting something, but rather making it work better for us. So that's just the note that I would leave that on, more or less, is sort of like, I agree with you that I'm curious to see what comes out of that. Like, I'm curious to see what precipitates from this, and I look forward to any reporting on the topic, whether I like it or not. I look forward to it.
Sure.
So I guess sort of the last thing I wanted to ask you is, so local journalists report on crime, just like random acts, like of anything, sometimes it can be really serious to, like where somebody's accused of being a sex offender, or somebody is a sex offender, or it can just be something as simple as like, there have been a copious amount of bear reports, and the police now have to issue a statement because they're getting too many bear reports and they don't want to keep giving the same answer all the time. You've got like a wide range of this kind of like local like crime, like to like crime scale. And now with the national conversation, there's a lot of serious scrutiny on local policing. And I mean, the Sentinel just, you guys had done a lot of document digging, which I appreciate. It's like it made me, I was doing my own document digging, and I felt like I was like relieved to see that that other people were trying to get the same stuff, and there were things that you guys got that I hadn't seen. One of which was, at least for Peterborough, their use of force policy, which I was like, I'm very gracious that that was published, because I think it highlights a question that I always have when I look at that kind of stuff. But how would you describe how much what you've reported on as over the past year or so, like how would you describe what you've reported on, and how does that line up with what people are asking for in terms of changes? Like, I'm wondering, how aligned are what you see bearing out in the news in terms of like, these are the amount of, like, just purely this is the number of incidents that we have that are violent or whatever, like basic factual stuff. How much does that line up with what you see being reported in the demands of protesters at events when they say, this is what we want, this is what we're trying to get? And I'm just kind of wondering about like that relationship, because I know that in certain communities there can be a disjointed nature between what's being demanded and what's actually maybe like showing to be the problem as is already public record. And I'm just wondering if you like, you don't, without getting too opinionated about it, I'm just curious to hear what you might be reflecting on in that way.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's a lot there. So the reporting you were referencing, that's just so people know, we got use of force policies from, I think it was 22 now departments in the Monadnock region, and the policies we have gotten are posted in full on our website. So if you want to go look up your town's policy, you can do that. The part of that project for me was, as you were saying, there are these calls for specific reforms in use of force policies. That's one of the things that has been discussed. Of course, there's much more, but I was sort of interested in, okay, how do existing policies around here line up with that stuff? That's things like, do they ban or limit the use of chokeholds? Another policy that a lot of departments have adopted is, not firing at moving vehicles, because that's potentially really risky and is just not that effective to begin with. Do policies require officers to try to de-escalate situations? Things like that. So basically reviewing those 20 or so policies, I found that a lot of them contain at least one of those elements. Few of them contain all of the elements. So that's something that, if local people are interested in knowing, what their specific policy says, they can look it up. The other point I just bring up about, though, that is, New Hampshire has one police academy. So generally, if you're a new officer at a New Hampshire department, you're going there for training. And so there's that sort of basic training is fairly consistent around New Hampshire. And so a lot of the things that individual policies may or may not speak to may be addressed in training. So this is one thing that police chiefs and other experts in New Hampshire have told me is, officers are not trained to use any kind of neck restraint. No chokehold, no what's called a carotid hold, which is basically a hold meant to sort of restrict blood flow and turn someone unconscious, but that can also have dangers. So police officers in New Hampshire are not trained to use any of those techniques. So, when a policy does not explicitly prohibit them, that doesn't mean that officers are out there using them, right? It might be just a matter of, it doesn't come up that much in New Hampshire, and therefore the local department didn't think to put that in there. That said, I think in the wake of George Floyd and the protests, a lot of departments are now saying, you know what, just to be sure, we want to add this very clear language on neck restraints. Same with de-escalation. I haven't really dug into what kind of training officers get on that in New Hampshire, but that would be, I think, an interesting subject to look at. Okay, what do policies say, but also just what is the training they receive? I was talking to a former police chief who now works as a policing consultant. He said he thinks of like three general factors when it comes to how a department's officers conduct themselves when it comes to use of force, which is, you start with a good policy, but then you also need good training and good supervision and oversight to make sure that, the rank and file officers are actually following their policy and following their training, right? So it's having a good policy, it's making sure officers are trained well, and then making sure that the department's leadership and supervisors are overseeing that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And then I think, like, so I guess like the follow-up question, I mean, this is really like related to, I mean, this is obviously a hyper specific like thing that just happened, and it happened last night. Peterborough has been doing listening sessions, and on racial justice and what the community can actually do about it. And they held a listening session 2 weeks ago, and we had a number of people in our community come out and tell stories that they had about their experiences with police. And there were two members of our community who are not white who shared their stories. And last night during the follow-up, something that happened was the police chief was called up to basically tell the side of the story that was it was the police's side of the story. He came up and he sort of told this, and then much of the community was outraged because they were noting that there was a drastic power differential between these individual citizens coming forward, feeling really afraid, telling their story in a very public forum, and then to 2 weeks later basically have an institutional power come on and more or less undermine their argument. Now, to me, I think there's plenty that, like, it's all saved on the internet, so it's something that I encourage everybody in the whole region to actually like see what's happening here, because it laid bare a lot of the problems that I think we should be, like, personally, again, to be saying this, I think we should be calling into question and examining, which is the role of optics, right? Like this notion of, a lot of the proposed solutions that they had were, we want to reinstate bike patrols and foot patrols in downtown areas. We want to have police and fire barbecue, public, like these events where, like, in the case of the barbecue, I'm like, okay, like I can see the motivations for wanting to do that, to wanting to sort of like increase familiarity with the police, and like, okay, sure. I also understand that, if I take a zoom out for a second and I think about like military tactics in occupied countries where, the stuff that they will do to try and create familiarity with local people in those communities to make it seem less oppressive that they're an occupying force, is kind of like, I wonder what the parallels between those things are, and not to politicize it, but I just, like, factually speaking, that's much the same thing of trying to sort of like inoculate the public this idea that it's the community that doesn't understand the police, right? So there's kind of this one aspect of it, and then there's sort of the other aspect of, well, we want to be more visible in the case of foot patrols or bike patrols, and to which many residents responded, that kind of sounds like more police, not less police. And I'm wondering, like, in this instance, I would say what it appears to me to be is a concern about visibility and the optics of a problem rather than the policy stuff. And we've spoken a lot about, like, what are the meaningful policy things, but have you witnessed optics being a main focus of towns, maybe say outside of Peterborough? Do you know what I'm getting? Like, I'm not asking you to speak on how you feel about those optics, but what I'm wondering is that is that something that exists more broadly? Is that a reaction that we're seeing from the institutions, whether it's the town itself or the police department, as like, okay, we need to make ourselves look friendly. And that's like sort of the first step that we identify, as opposed to say maybe what the public is calling for, which is to say we want to see meaningful policy shifts first. Do you see that being a concern that they're having?
Yeah, so let me think about that for a sec.
Sure.
So just to be clear, I haven't watched that Peterborough
Right.
forum yet, so I can't speak to that
Of course.
specific case. But
Of course.
the question of optics and policy and reform, it's I think just more broadly, there's such a spectrum of things that we're discussing right now, locally, nationally, and that ranges from, again, these discussions over statues and naming things that are kind of more on the symbolic end, but do matter as symbols, all the way up to, um, relatively small reforms to sort of very sweeping ideas. And I think in the Monadnock region, we're seeing kind of a mix of all of that. In terms of the optics, I'm thinking about Keene. One of the first big protests after George Floyd, the police chief, the county sheriff, and one of the Keene police officers were actually like in the protest itself carrying signs saying, we hear you. And there were also some officers just in uniform, standing kind of on the edges of the square, just, there as a presence. And so I think, I don't want to, dismiss that at all. I think
Sure.
it's, a genuine sense that from these law enforcement leaders that, they saw the community was, you know, was thinking about these issues and they wanted to go out there and say, yeah, like, we don't support what happened to George Floyd. That's been pretty universally condemned from all the police departments here I've talked to. We want to be responsive to the community. So I think that step does matter, right? Going out there and showing, as we've seen police in other places really respond to some of the protests with, let's just say, very different reactions. I think another example is, in Dublin, I believe there were some residents who circulated a letter to the police chief, and this was actually a department that initially did not give me the use of force policy, and then I don't know exactly what the timeline is here, but at some point, some local residents said they were interested in knowing more about the policies, and he did ultimately, release a version of the policy and made some updates. So I definitely get the sense that, there are some of these police chiefs who are listening to what's going on. I think the question I have now is, there are some people really interested in these sort of more substantial changes to, you can call it defund, you can call it shifting funds, you can call it, reimagining public safety, but just these broader goals. And I'm interested where that goes, right? A year from now, are we still discussing that? How much of a constituency is there for that, right? Beyond, the people who are really, really active right now? Is that an idea that maybe, a lot of people in Keene have an interest in, or is it really, just the people who are showing up to these public meetings?
Right.
I know there's been, discussion of the Keene Bearcat, the armored vehicle. So that's something that might be on the table. So I don't know. I think you're going to see continued discussion of these things, ranging again from sort of relatively small reforms to certain policies that departments can just do themselves, as kind of like updating a policy to bring it in line with some of these ideas that are out there. I think there's going to be discussion of some of these more sweeping ideas, and I think, as with anything that's kind of a substantial change, there's probably going to be some resistance to that or pushback. And so,
right.
I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be certainly interesting to watch and cover. One thing I've been talking to some of the activists who are working in the region, but I think it'll, also be interesting to talk to. I'd also like to talk to more police officers, not necessarily chiefs, just officers in the region, and
Yeah.
are they? What do they think of all this? Are they thinking about their job in a different way? Are they
Right.
sympathetic to some of these ideas? I know one thing that has been discussed is just how much police officers have to respond to like mental health calls or
Mm-hmm.
intoxication calls, right?
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in whether police officers in the region uh, feel like, do they like having that as part of their job? Do they feel like they'd rather have someone else do that? That's like a question I don't really know. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's an awesome question actually. I think that is a super interesting question that I would love to hear the answer for or to. So I really look forward to that reporting.
All right, that's a story I'll put on the list.
Cool, cool. Thanks, man. Well, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. And this was a great conversation. It's exactly what I was like. I've been really wanting to have a conversation like this on the channel for a while now. So thank you for coming and indulging me.
Yeah, it was an interesting conversation. Thanks for
Cool.
having me.
Yeah.
And I would just again encourage anyone who has questions about how we work, or wants us to cover something, or has an issue with how we cover something, please, feel free to email me.
Sounds great. Awesome. Well, hey, Paul, thank you so much for coming on today, and we'll catch up soon. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye. So that was Paul Cuno-Booth from the Keene Sentinel. That was a really good conversation. At least I feel that way. I learned a lot myself, and I hope that other people learn things from it as well, because I just want us to have a better understanding of everything. And I think in a lot of ways, I said what I needed to say. Maybe I'll come back tomorrow. Carlos Cardona is going to be on the show, and that's going to be really fun. I'm really looking forward to having that conversation. Talk about New Hampshire Progressive Coalition and just sort of what kind of moves the progressive left in the state is trying to make over the next 2 years in terms of electoral goals and trying to push policy and stuff like that. So I'm excited to talk to Carlos about that. Excited to talk to him about Puerto Rico. He's shown me some cool recipes. So that's always a thing. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that. And maybe he and I can talk a little bit more about some of what it means to alienate people who are more likely to feel othered in their community. Because I think that's something, especially being where Carlos is up in Laconia, that he experiences often. So I think it'll be important to hear from him on that. But thank you to anybody who tuned in today. Obviously, you can go to our Twitter. You can follow us there. You can go to our Patreon. You can support us. You can hit the subscribe button down in the corner. Little bell will give you notifications anytime we go live, so you can tune into this and catch these things. Again, it happens, barring anything crazy, 11 o'clock on Wednesdays and Thursdays. It's the local show and the live show. So, yeah, and I know a lot of people catch this stuff in, after it's broadcast, which is totally cool. And something that I'm going to try and get to doing is getting chapters logged so make it easier for people to hop through different topics. So that's something that's coming up. And yeah, so should have some more stuff prepared, looking at more documents today. So hopefully we can get some more of that information out in the air. And yeah, so thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll catch you tomorrow. Later.